Alright, so here's another video if you need some help with graphing these parabolas in vertex form. Remember, when I say vertex form, I'm talking about this y equals a times x minus h squared plus k. So this should help you out with the second page, numbers 5, 6, 7, and 8 of your homework assignment 2.1. It's the same as the first page, except now we have an a value that does not equal 1. So that's just going to throw a little wrinkle into what we're doing, but the process is essentially the same. And this assignment is asking you first to figure out your vertex. So let's remember that the vertex is always going to be h comma k. So in this example, I have this plus 3 here. So if I match that up with this minus h here, well, what do I need to subtract from h so that I see x? Sorry, what do I need to subtract from x so that I see x plus 3? So remember that h is going to be the opposite of what I see there. So if I do x minus a negative 3, that's what gives me this x plus 3. So h is negative 3. I have negative 1 here, and that is my plus k, so my vertex is this point, negative 3, negative 1. This homework also wants me to find the axis of symmetry, and remember that the axis of symmetry is always going to be the vertical line x equals h, which in this case is negative 3. So if I look at that on my graph, that's going to be this blue line up and down that I'm drawing here, right, at x equals negative 3. So my whole parabola is going to be divided down the middle by that axis of symmetry. Next part of this homework is it wants you to figure out the range of your parabola. So remember, the range is all of my y values. And this is where a comes in, because the range is going to depend on both a and k. If I put my vertex negative 3 comma negative 1 on the graph, I'll make this big black point here. This is when x is negative 3 and y is negative 1. And I know my parabola is either going to open up from there or down from there. So if a is positive, I'll have some parabola that opens up like this, right? And if a is negative, I'll have some parabola that opens down like this. Well, here, my a value is negative 1/2. So I know that this parabola is going to open down, right? So if I look at this and I think about a parabola that opens down, all of my y values are going to be below the vertex. So the range is going to be all the y values that are below that point, negative 3 comma negative 1. So I'll do y is everything lesser or equal to negative 1. Your range is always going to depend on k. It just depends on if a is positive or negative, if it's going to be below or above k. So in this case, because a is negative, my range is all the points below k. If a was positive and I had a parabola that was opening up like this, then my range would be all the points above negative 1. But again, here, because a is negative, my range is going down. So I found my vertex, I found the axis of symmetry, and I stated the range. So the rest of this homework is just asking you to sketch a graph of this. So remember, when you're sketching a graph, you get to pick the x points that you want to plug in, but then you just have to make sure that you calculate the right y values for those x points. So the thing that makes this one a little tricky is that a is a fraction, which just makes the calculations a little bit more complicated, but it's not changing the actual process of what I'm doing. So let's just plug in a couple of x values on one side of the axis of symmetry and then use the symmetry to figure out what the other side of the parabola is going to look like. A trick here though, because I'm dealing with fractions, I want to think what x values are going to make my life easier. So if I'm dividing by 2, I want the inside, I want this x plus 3 squared thing that I'm dealing with to be even, if possible, because when this is even, then when I divide by 2, I'm not going to get a fraction. I'll still get a whole number. So let me show you what I mean by that. Let's say I tried plugging in x equals -2. Well then what I'm going to get is -1/2 times -2 plus 3 all squared minus 1. So on the inside here, I'm going to have -1 squared, which is going to be 1. But then I'm going to need to multiply -1/2 times 1 minus 1. And this is going to give me a fraction. Now you can do fractions if you want, but whenever possible, it's nice to avoid them, just because they're kind of tough to deal with. So what if I say, I don't want to do this with fractions, nobody's got time for that. Let's plug in a different x value so that I don't have to deal with a fraction. And the trick here is if I notice, well, okay, I'm dividing by 2 in my fraction, so as long as I get the x plus 3 squared part to be an even number, that fraction will divide out evenly. So how do I get an even number there on the middle? So what if I try when x is -1? Well, then I'll have -1/2 times -1 plus 3 is going to be 2, and then I'll square that, minus 1 equals -1/2 times 4 minus 1. And look how much better this has made my life, because now I have 4 divided by 2, right? -1/2 times 4 is going to be -2 and then minus 1. So I got that fraction to disappear because what I had in here was an even number. So then this is going to be -3. So when x is -1, y is -3. Let's put that point on our graph. Alright, let's plug in one more point here on the right side. And again, I want to avoid dealing with fractions whenever possible. So if I plug in x equals 0, well then I'm going to get 3 squared on the inside there. And I'm going to have to deal with this 9/2 business, which is not pretty. I don't like fractions when I can avoid them. So instead, let's try plugging in an x value that won't make me have to deal with a fraction. So if I plug in x equals 1, then I'll get -1/2 times 4 on the inside there. 4 squared minus 1. So this is going to be -1/2 times 16 minus 1 equals -8 minus 1 equals -9. So because I got this thing on the middle to be an even number, this fraction just divided out evenly, and I don't have to mess around with it. And now let's plot this point on our graph. X is 1, y is -9. So that's going to be something down here. And now the last step is I can just use the symmetry to put the points on the other side. So I know that -1 is 2 to the right of my axis of symmetry, so if I go 2 to the left of the axis of symmetry, that's going to put me at -5 on the x side, and then I'll just put the y point the same place, -3. Then if I go 2 more over, now I'm on the opposite side of the axis of symmetry, the point that mirrors from this 1 and -9, so that's going to be -7 and -9. And I'll connect these points, and that's my graph. So when a is a fraction, that can make your math tricky, but you can make it easier on yourself if you pick x values that help you avoid fractions. So sometimes you're going to have to deal with fractions, and in that case, that's fine, you can do that math, but whenever possible, let's make our lives easier rather than harder, right?